All right, so I think I'm live on both TikTok and YouTube. So it is Sunday, and each Sunday between now and the end of I guess the end of April, beginning of May, I'm going to be going live answering your questions about AP Lang. So if you are an AP Lang student and you're looking for a little extra help, you want to know more about what to expect on test day, then let me know your questions in the chat because I want to help you prepare for the exam. So while we're waiting for people to kind of hop on and ask some questions, I figured I would talk a little bit about how you can start preparing for the AP Lang test because I know it's a few months away, but at the same time, it's good to get a head start. And there's different things that you can do now that aren't super difficult to help you prepare for the AP Lang exam. Okay, so when should you start preparing? Well, technically, if you're in the class, you're already doing certain things to prepare, which is good. If you're self studying for the exam, then you're going to want to make sure that you're doing some of those things that we would be doing in class. So, one of the things to keep in mind is that you are going to be working on multiple choice and FRQs, the essays. So if you happen to also be studying for something like the ACT or the SAT, that's great because that can also be counted as studying for the AP Lang multiple choice. So here are some things that you want to look for if you're trying to study for the SAT and ACT and also help your AP Lang score. For the reading, definitely look at like some SAT reading tests, specifically the passages that are nonfiction, so not the literary narrative one. You don't need to pay attention to questions about graphs necessarily or anything that says what's the best evidence for the previous question. But the other questions on the SAT reading are very similar to AP Lang. And since there aren't a lot of AP Lang questions out there, there's a lot on Classroom, but not everybody has AP Classroom. Using the SAT test can be a great way to prepare because there are multiple versions of that. And you can sit down and time yourself for those passages and do that like once a month until the exam, that kind of thing. You can also use the writing and language section or ACT English if you're using that one to prepare for AP writing questions. So those are the ones where it asks you like, should the writer add this sentence? Should they reorganize this paragraph? Practicing with those can be a way to double dip because you're preparing for your SAT and ACT and you're preparing for the AP Lang test. And they have free resources online, so you don't need to buy a test book or anything. That would be one thing that I would say students could start doing to prepare for the AP Lang exam. Something else is broadening your knowledge in general, because question 3, the argument essay, can be the hardest for some people. For me, it is. I think it's the hardest one. So here's some little things that you can be doing that would help you broaden your world knowledge. First of all, pay attention in your other classes, especially history, because a lot of times you can use historical examples as very good, concrete, specific evidence. So pay attention in history, but also other classes too. Because a lot of my students that take like APUSH, a lot of times they're able to connect something they learned in APUSH to whatever prompt we're talking about. So that would be one thing. Something else that I have my students do is I have them start to look at topics of interest. So there's not like a magical list of things that I could tell you to study, but choose something you're interested in. If you like sports, maybe watch a documentary about, I don't know, Gabby Douglas, Simone Biles, something like that. There's a really good one on Netflix about this swimmer, and she was from Syria. She competed in the Olympics. She's actually on TikTok too. So you can literally watch a Netflix documentary, and technically it could be counted as studying for AP Lang. Because you want to broaden your world knowledge. So choose something that you're interested in and start listening to podcasts or watching documentaries or TED Talks about it. But choose something that's of interest to you. But just know that as you study for classes like AP Gov or AP US History, even things like kind of AP Bio, maybe to a small extent, AP World, you're actually helping yourself study for AP Lang. I think it's also really helpful for students to be studying current events. And this doesn't have to be anything big, but make sure that you are aware of what's going on in the world. So if there's something major happening, just check, read a couple articles about it, that kind of thing, because a lot of times what happens on question 3 is students try to write about something that they've maybe heard about, like, I don't know, like Russia and Ukraine or COVID or something like that. But then just because people have been talking about it doesn't mean that you have the specific evidence you need. So make sure that you're informed about some of those world issues just in case they fit your prompt as well. Awesome. So if you're just joining us either on YouTube or TikTok, feel free to ask questions in the chat because I'd love to help you. Feel free to ask questions about like multiple choice, the FRQs. What is a synthesis essay? Okay, great question. So a synthesis essay is the first one on the exam. You can technically answer them in any order, but when you open your booklet on exam day, you're going to see the synthesis essay first, and you're going to see a prompt, and it's going to list your sources. And then the next several pages are going to be the sources. So the sources can be anything like an excerpt from a book, an article, a blog post. It might be a picture. So they have to have at least one visual text. So you might get a photograph, you might get a chart. Um, one year they put a schedule on there. So you basically get 6 to 8 sources. Now, the goal of a synthesis essay is to use the sources to support your own argument. So you're not summarizing the sources. That's kind of where people sometimes make a mistake. You're not writing a summary of each source. What you're doing is you're actually writing an argument that you're using the sources to support that. So it's basically like a mini research paper. This one is the most time consuming because of all the sources. Technically, they give you 15 minutes of a reading period and they recommend 40 minutes per essay. But I feel like the synthesis is the most demanding because there's the most to read. So what you want to do with a synthesis essay is you definitely want to make sure that you have 3 sources because that's going to make you eligible for a higher score. You don't get any kind of bonus points if you cite all the sources. And I think APUSH and maybe AP World, you have to use all the sources, but in AP Lang, you don't. So 3 to 4 sources is normal. If you only have like 1 or 2, that's going to lower your score. So you want to basically have a thesis, an argument in response to the prompt, and usually 2, maybe 3 body paragraphs that support that thesis. And that's where you're going to be bringing in evidence from the sources and you're going to have your evidence and commentary. So that's what a synthesis essay is. It's basically a mini research paper. They've done the research for you. They give you the sources that represent different sides of the issue. And then you have to use those to create or to support your argument. So yeah, it's kind of like the analogy I give in my class sometimes is it's like the TV show Chopped, because in Chopped, everybody has like these baskets of food and you all get the same like ingredients, but those ingredients are like the sources. So what you do with them is up to you. And you can make a different recipe than the person next to you, meaning like you can argue something different than what they argue. But at the end of the day, you're using those ingredients or those sources in order to construct your argument. If you have questions about synthesis, I do have a few videos on my YouTube channel. One that gives like a more detailed overview of what synthesis is, but I also have other videos about like how to plan a synthesis essay and write commentary for it. So if you want like more details about that, definitely check out Coach Hall Writes on YouTube. I also answer questions here on TikTok. I'm really close to 10K on TikTok. And the reason why that matters is because if I get to 10K, I can make playlists. So what I can start to do is I can take all my videos that are about, let's say, synthesis or rhetorical analysis, or even just commentary, and I can start making playlists kind of like I do on YouTube. And that way, if you're trying to study for something specific, instead of having to scroll through all those videos, if you happen to go to my page, you can just go to the playlist. So if you're not following already and you're an AP Lang student, I would love a follow just so if I can reach 10K, I can start doing playlists. And I promise that will be helpful as it gets closer to the exam. So basically, yeah, we want to have synthesis be where we're using the sources to support our argument. But thank you so much. That was a great question. I saw another question here about, is it like a DBQ? The answer is yes, except there are a few differences. A DBQ, I think you have to use all the sources. In synthesis, you don't. And sometimes the writing style might be different, but like it is most closely related to a DBQ, yes. So a lot of my students who are in APUSH, they say that once they learn what the APUSH teacher wants for a DBQ and once they know what I want for synthesis, they kind of know that they're like cousins. Like they're not exactly the same type of essay, but they're very similar. So for instance, how you cite sources, how you embed the quotes, that's going to be somewhat similar. But definitely listen to your APUSH or AP World teacher about what to do for a DBQ and listen to your Lang teacher about synthesis, but they are closely related. So my students who have done a DBQ in the past, they're less surprised when they get to synthesis. Awesome. So that was a great question. But yes, if you're not in APUSH or AP World, don't worry. The synthesis essay, is not as hard as it sounds because you have the sources. And so one question that students sometimes ask is like, what if I'm given a topic that I don't know about? Because a couple years ago, they put a topic on there about eminent domain, which is basically when the government can take people's property and use it for the greater good. They do define those kinds of things for you, but a lot of students were like, I have no clue what this is. I don't know how to write about it. So here's the thing, with something like that, if you don't know what the topic is, you don't have an opinion on it or anything like that, then just maybe brainstorm a little bit if you can, but it's probably better if you just go straight to the sources and look at the sources and try to figure out, okay, which one has the most compelling argument? Which sources do I agree with? What can I say? Because nobody's going to come like looking for you and be like, oh, well, you argued this and that's not what you should have argued. Don't worry about that kind of thing. Just argue what makes most sense on test day. But they've done a really good job lately of taking the topic and giving you an appropriate definition. So that way there shouldn't be any question of like, what is this? Even if it's a topic you haven't heard of. But if you've never thought of that topic before for your synthesis essay, don't stress out. Just start reading your sources. That's all you got to do. All right, so we have a question over on YouTube about tips for the multiple choice portion. So I have lots of different tips depending on where you're struggling. So let me just give you some of the ones that have helped my students the most. First of all, there's going to be reading questions and writing questions. So the first two passages are reading passages. Those are like the comprehension ones. Those passages are going to be longer. Chances are it's going to be boring and there's going to be a lot more questions, right? But the writing ones are more like editing. Those don't take as long. The passages are shorter. There are fewer questions. And at the top of those, it's going to say something like, this is a draft. Most of my students tend to do better on the writing questions, or at least they like the writing questions. So if you are somebody who kind of struggles with the reading, know that that might take longer. Even though it's approximately half of your test, you might spend 35 minutes on that, and then you might spend the other 25 minutes of your hour on the writing questions, and that's okay. I even have had a couple students in the past turn straight to the writing questions and go answer those because they knew they were going to be super accurate with those. And then they knew that they just had to kind of do the best they could with the reading. So that might be something to consider, is play to your strengths. If you are stronger with the writing questions, make sure you have plenty of time for that. Now, as far as tips for actually approaching multiple choice, sometimes it helps students to read the questions and then read the passage. Sometimes students don't like that though. So it kind of depends on if that helps you or not. Sometimes it really does help to kind of know what you're looking for. You should expect some questions about like, what is the purpose or the function of the first passage? You should expect some questions about maybe the second paragraph or the last paragraph. So they usually ask a question about the first paragraph, maybe the last paragraph. They're going to ask you questions about like, what does this word mean in context? For those, always read the surrounding sentences too. So read like at least one sentence before it and one sentence after, because there's usually a context clue. So if it says like in line 55, the word whatever most nearly means, chances are that word is a word that has multiple different meanings. And so if you just read line 55, then you might not get the right answer. So read the surrounding sentences as well. And that will usually help your accuracy. Also, a lot of the questions are ones that should be explicitly stated somewhere in the passage. Now, not all of them are going to be like that, but make sure that you are going back to the passage and really making sure that you're answering the question being asked, because you get 5 answer choices. So 2 of them are going to be throwaway answers. There's going to be 2 answer choices where they don't make sense. They're just not the right answer. There's usually going to be one that's kind of like using keywords from the passage, but if you've read the passage, you're like, no, this is not it. And then there's going to be the remaining 2, and this is where people get stuck because they can narrow it down to like 2 and then they have to decide. So you want to make sure that you're choosing the answer that best answers the question being asked. Really look at the word choice, because sometimes one word might be less precise or it might be inaccurate to the passage, and then that's what makes that answer choice wrong. So really look at the nuance of the wording there. But those are just some general tips for multiple choice. Multiple choice is going to be worth 45% of your composite score, so a little bit less than half. Each question is worth 1 point because there are 45 questions. So strategically, don't spend too much time on any one particular question, because what if you spend like, I don't know, 3 minutes on one question, but you still get it wrong? And in those same like 2.5 minutes that you overthought it, what if you could have answered four more questions and gotten that right? So no matter how hard the question is, whether it's reading or writing or whatever, it's still worth 1 point. So it's okay to like go on and then come back. That's something to keep in mind as well, is you want to answer every question, even if it's a guess. So pick a letter, and if you don't have time at the end, let's say there's like a minute left and you still have 10 questions that you haven't answered, choose a letter, A, D, whatever it is, and just bubble that letter in, because at least you're giving yourself a 20% chance of getting it right, because there's 5 answer choices. So you're giving yourself a shot. Do not leave any questions blank on test day. But that's a great question. Let's see what else we got. We got a lot more coming in on TikTok. So let me see what we've got. For argument essay, what are things to do to prepare? I would say play to your strengths. So I have my students, when it gets closer to the exam, they do something called a Q3 database. And this is an activity that I will be doing in a class, either here on TikTok or like separately. I'll walk you guys through that same exercise that I do with my students, but I have them choose topics that they're readily familiar with, things that are pretty versatile. So last year, one of my students loved the musical Hamilton. She was super strong in APUSH. Her mom was actually the APUSH teacher. And so like Hamilton went on her database, and lo and behold, she was able to use Hamilton on her prompt. So like choose things that you know well, that you could write about well, and try to have like ideas from different categories. So try to choose a couple famous people or famous historical events that you could write about, be knowledgeable of a couple current events. And I'm not promising that you'll always be able to use these things, but it has helped my students if they kind of had like topics that they could write about well, because then it took some of the pressure off. Now, you don't want to just make those things fit the prompt, because they won't always fit the prompt, but it kind of helps to go into it knowing, okay, these are some things that I could write about, that kind of thing. But be as specific as you can be with your evidence. So basically, right now, I would say gather that knowledge. Start to choose like 3 to 5 people, 3 to 5 events that you could like listen to a TED Talk about, or a podcast, or watch a documentary. Because if you have that specific knowledge, it makes your essay read so much better. Do you have a specific test from the College Board that's good for multiple choice practice? So I use the ones from the College Board. It's like the SAT Suite, like SUITE. They had 10 total, and I think these are also the ones that are on Khan Academy. If you're not familiar with that, it's KHAN. And I think they took some of them down. So I think like right now, test number 1 is definitely available, and I use that with some of my tutoring students. I have some of my tutoring students look at test number 3. Honestly, they're all supposed to be sort of equal. So as long as you can find one from the College Board, it should be fine. There's also ACT tests out there if you're studying for the ACT, because remember, the SAT and ACT questions do sort of overlap with AP Lang. So as long as it's an official test from either ACT or the College Board SAT, you should be fine. Some tests I don't even know that I could say that some are easier than others. I feel like it all kind of balances out. So there's not one that I would say, yes, go to this one. I always start with test 1, because that way I know I'm going through them in numerical order, and that way I don't get like lost or something. So that's where I would start, but not because it's the best test, but just because it's an easier way to keep track. How do you improve time management? This is going to sound counterintuitive, but one thing to do to improve your time management is to actually make sure you plan your essay. And I don't mean like a huge detailed outline, but make sure you know your thesis and your main ideas, and ideally your evidence and possibly your commentary. That probably sounds like I just said write your whole essay, but hear me out on this. When I have my students do a timed essay or something in class, if we're prepping for it the day before, we write out our thesis, and I have them figure out main idea 1, main idea 2. Most of my students only write 2 body paragraphs, and that works well for them. And then I ask them, okay, now that you've chosen your main ideas that are supposed to be based off your thesis, then what is the best evidence that you can use to prove main idea 1? And they will either like mark it on their passage, or they'll put a little bullet point. We're not writing full sentences for these outlines. It just has to make sense to you. The reason why this helps save you time though and improve your pacing is because if you get lost during the writing process, let's say you forget your train of thought or you get stuck or something, you have a blueprint to go on. And so it's kind of like your crutch. It also helps because if you plan it in advance, you're probably going to have a better line of reasoning. So you want to make sure that you're not just like stream of consciousness writing because that doesn't usually end well. Usually that means that your ideas are going to at some point become disconnected. So planning a quick bullet point outline, keep it super simple, helps. Also, just as someone who has written essays before, I write them with my students. I do like a mock with them once a year. But I also, when I was taking standardized tests in like high school and college and things, I would always tell myself like, oh, like I'm going to remember that idea. And then like sometimes I wouldn't. So I got in the habit, especially because I was an English major and we sometimes had to do timed essays. If you have an idea of something you want to say in your essay, write it down. Write it down on your planning sheet, like your scratch paper, your essay booklet. Just write it somewhere where you know where it is because chances are under pressure, you're not going to remember that good thought like 10 minutes later when you need it. So just write it down. And that's why the planning can help as well. Other things to do to save time, keep your intro short. You just need worst case scenario, just a thesis, but ideally a couple sentences and then a thesis. When I see intros that like literally take up like half a page or more, I get skeptical because I'm like, you probably just wasted a lot of time on this intro when all I needed was your thesis. Now I know some people are like, but what about the sophistication point? But like you earn that consistently throughout your whole essay. So keep your intro short. Don't waste time on your intro. Just a couple sentences plus a thesis is good. The other thing that you need to realize is that conclusions are not required. So if you are running out of time, don't rush a body paragraph just to write a conclusion because your body paragraphs are the most important. I would much rather my students write 2 good body paragraphs and not have a conclusion than have 2 mediocre body paragraphs and a conclusion. So saving time, one thing to do is in a lot of cases, just don't worry about that conclusion because it's for most students, it's really not going to help the way you think it might. Someone said, do you on YouTube, do you recommend digital or offline testing? I'm not totally sure I understand what you mean by that. If you're preparing for the digital exam, because I know that like some schools it's chosen for you. Some people are doing the digital test. My students are doing paper and we will do paper until we're forced to do digital. But I find that my students do better with a paper test. So if you're asking if you have the choice between digital and paper, a lot of teachers recommend paper, but it could be a personal choice. The one thing I will say is that a lot of students type faster than they handwrite, so that could benefit you. But a lot of my students dislike having to take multiple choice on the computer because they don't get to annotate the same way and like see things the way they want to. So in general, I prefer the paper test. So I'm not sure if that's exactly what you were asking. If not, feel free to like clarify in the chat and I'd be happy to answer again. But I tend to recommend students try to take the paper test if at all possible. Let's see. Should I qualify my argument with a concession paragraph and refute the opposing claim? That's a great question. If you have time to do so, that can be a way to strengthen your argument. Some teachers tell their students that they either should do that or they have to do that. It can be a way to strengthen your argument, but I've also read a lot of essays where it seemed like the counter argument, like addressing it like that, was really forced and it didn't really help the essay. So I would ask yourself, is this going to be the best use of my time? Is this going to be most convincing? Because if the answer is yes, then I say go for it. Because especially if you're trying for like a more nuanced argument, qualifying it and including a concession and refutation can be helpful. That being said, sometimes you can weave those into your existing body paragraphs. And so it doesn't necessarily have to be like its own separate paragraph. It can be, but it doesn't have to be. I would say if you don't have time for one, don't force it. If you're looking for like an example of how to add it in kind of like in a more subtle way, my students, my 10th graders just did the locavore synthesis prompt. So locavore is like people who eat local food. And it's the old rubric. So it's the 9-point rubric, but there is a sample essay that scored an 8 out of 9. and they have some like concessions and refutations or counterclaims and rebuttals in their paragraphs. And that was one of the things that I pointed out to my students was when we were going over that sample essay this week. There's ways to acknowledge the opposing point and refute it to further your argument without it having to be a full paragraph. So if you're curious about that, that sample essay is a good one to look up. I also have a video on my channel that's a couple years old at this point, but it deals with concessions and refutations, and it kind of shows how to do it in like a similar way where you're incorporating it into your existing main point and not having to make it something else. So yeah, definitely like it's good to know how to write a concession and refutation, but I don't think it's like I don't think you should force yourself to do it if you don't have time or if it's not what's best for your argument. But good question though. In general, qualified arguments do tend to read better, but they're also a little bit harder to write under pressure. What are your favorite argument prompts to practice as you're preparing for Q3? Okay, so let me break it down for like the ones that I think are the easy ones and the hard ones because I like them for different reasons. The ones that I think are like easy, if you will, I really like the disobedience prompt. That might have been 2017. I could be getting the year wrong. And I also really like exploring the unknown. I think that one was 2018. Those I consider somewhat easy. I consider those very approachable. And so those are two that I like to start with for my students. I also have a prompt that I give my students about like competition and another one about failure. So the value of competition and the value of failure. I know I did at least one, if not both of those as like a video series on my channel called Class with Coach Hall. And I'm going to be doing at least one or two more of those before the exam. So if you want to kind of see how I break down my process for my students, then if you go on my channel, there's a playlist Class with Coach Hall. And I have like, I think 2 different argument videos, like a series there. But those are also approachable prompts. The value of failure, the value of competition. So those are the ones that I like to start with because they're still difficult, but they're maybe not the most difficult. And then I try to give my students some that are a little bit harder once they're comfortable with those that I just mentioned. I like to have students do the overrated prompt because that one to me is a little different than the others. Basically, you have to choose one concept or place or whatever it is that's overrated and prove why. And the thought process behind that, even though it's still an argument essay, feels a little different than the others. So I always worry that they're going to do something like that one again. So I want my students to be prepared for that one. Even though you're not going to get that exact prompt again, I feel like that's a good one to practice as well. So the overrated one, I think last year's prompt about timely decisions is a little bit harder. So that would maybe be one that I would encourage students to look at as well. And then the striving for perfection one from 2 years ago is kind of in the middle. Like some students do really well with it. Some students kind of struggle with it. So I tend to use the most current ones. I don't go back to the ones from like the early 2000s or like the 90s, like just because so much has changed about the exam since then. So there's a couple of prompts that are really popular. Like there's one about like dissent and other things. And I think those can be very valuable. But for preparing for the exam, I really do try to stick with prompts that have been in the last 5 to 10 years. Just personal preference. All right. So someone just asked, what can I expect to see in the stream? So I'm Coach Hall. I am an AP Lang teacher from Arkansas, and I have a YouTube channel and TikTok, Coach Hall Writes, where I give students tips to help them prepare for the AP Lang exam. The AP Lang exam is going to be in May, so we're a few months out. And basically through the different tips and tricks that I give my own students and those online, we've seen some great results with scores. So I'm here to help with any questions that you have. Because AP Lang can be a little difficult, especially with the fact that you have 40 minutes to write most of your essays. So if you're a student, feel free to ask questions either in the YouTube chat or over on TikTok. And if you're on TikTok, do me a huge favor and feel free to ask a question. But if you're getting good info from this, tap your screen a few times to get some likes because that'll hopefully get some other students involved as well. But yeah, we're just kind of going over just general stuff for the AP Lang exam. I think one of the big things right now that students might be stressing about is like, what scores should I be getting too? So if you are getting right now, if you're getting like a 4 out of 6 or a 130, that's actually pretty good, right? Like that's kind of, uh-oh, what happened on TikTok? Oh, that's weird. Okay, well, apparently it like changed a filter. But anyway, if you're getting like a 130, that's actually not bad. A lot of students want to know about the sophistication point, and honestly, I would not stress about that right now. It can be good to know how to do it, but you do not want to stress about the sophistication point. You should be focusing on your evidence and commentary. Those are going to be the bulk of your score, and that's going to be the most important part. Okay, I literally don't know why this changed to this weird like Technicolor filter, and I don't know how to take it off because I like did not touch it. That's weird. I got a 31 on multiple choice. How is that? That's good. That is a decent score. I'm gonna like back out of this, I guess, on TikTok and then come back on. Hopefully, all will come back because I cannot look at myself in this like Technicolor thing. I don't know how to change it though, but that's weird. But a 31 on multiple choice is good. But let me like close this off and then I'll hop on live again, hopefully without this ridiculous filter, and we'll talk about what a good multiple choice score is. But congrats on your 31. That's good. Okay, so sorry about that if you're watching on YouTube. I don't know what happened, but basically I was on TikTok and it started doing like this Technicolor thing and it was really kind of weird to watch. So we're going to go back live on TikTok again. The weird thing is I didn't touch anything. It just made me Technicolor. Okay, so let's talk about scores that we should be aiming for AP Lang. Because I think if you know how the test is scored, that can help you be more strategic. So for the AP Lang exam, if you're trying to figure out how to get a certain score, you want to realize that each multiple choice question is worth 1 point. And then each of your essays, you're going to take your essay score. It's going to be a number out of 6 points. And you're going to multiply that by 3.0566. And so if you do that for each of your essays, and then you add your multiple choice to it, and then you round, you're going to get a number. And that's the number that they use to determine your composite score. So basically, if you are answering, let's see, for multiple choice, if you're answering at least 23 out of 45 multiple choice and you're getting like a 4 out of 6 on each of your essays, then you are probably on track for a 3 composite. So let me say that again. If you are getting a 23 out of 45 on your multiple choice, and then you are getting 4 out of 6 on your essays, you're on track for a 3. Now, if you are getting like between 30 and 35 on your multiple choice and maybe like a 4 on your essays, maybe 1.5, you could be closer to a 4 composite and that kind of thing. So here's how you calculate your score. If you happen to know how many multiple choice you got right, give yourself 1 point for all of those. So before I had to switch lives, somebody said that they got 31 multiple choice. So what we would do is we'd say 31. So I'm actually going to calculate this all. So we got like our 31 multiple choice, right? Let's say that person does a 4 on their synthesis essay. So I would take 4 and I would multiply it by 3.0566 and I would get that number. And then let's say for the rhetorical analysis, we'll give them a 5, right? So I would do 5 times 3.5 or 3.0566. And then let's say for their argument, let's say they go back down to a 4. So I do 4 times 3.566. So what I would do is, it's probably gonna be backwards for y'all and you might not be able to see it, but that's how I do this for my students. So I multiply it out and then I add it together. And then that we round it and it gets a whole number. And then that's where this comes into play. It's probably gonna be backwards for y'all again. But whatever number you get, if it's between 0 and 35, you basically made a 1 composite. And again, sorry if it's backwards. And if you're watching me on YouTube, let me try to hold it better. Okay. So then if you are between like a 36 and a 51, that's going to be a 2 composite. And then if you're between a 52 and a 62, it's a 3 composite. A 63 to a 72 is a 4 composite. And then 73 to 100 points is a 5 composite. So I have my students do a mock exam and we calculate it just like I showed you. We figure out their multiple choice in each of their 3 essays. And that kind of tells us ballpark, like at this point in the year, like where they are. And then a lot of students will find like, oh, I had 54 points. Well, that would give them a 3, but it's like a low 3. So my goal for them would be like, let's try to get closer to that, like 60 range, because then you're like more comfortably in that. So anyway, I do have a TikTok video about like how this breaks down. But, and again, it's probably like backwards on yours, but that's just kind of like the general scoring breakdown. It's not perfect because sometimes the College Board kind of shifts things a little bit. I don't want to say curves because it's not really curving it, but that's kind of close. So if you're trying to figure out like, am I on track for the 5 composite that I want to make? You can do that math to figure it out. So anyway, I hope that was helpful. I'm sorry I don't have like the right tech to show you all as I do it, but that's kind of how we calculate things. So someone had previously asked, like, if I make 31 multiple choice, is that good? Like, yeah, 31 out of 45 is good. For AP Lang multiple choice, you're not expected to make 100. I know that can be really hard to hear. And some people do make really good scores, but I think what happens is when people see like, oh, I only answered 26 out of 45 and I'm at like, I don't know, 60%, we associate a 60% as like a D, and like, no, like as long as you're above half, like you're actually doing fine at this point. So that can be like a little mindset shift that we need to get over. Thoughts on pre-writing for the essays. So I think you should at least outline, but keep it simple, bullet point, kind of like your thesis, your main ideas, and then whatever you feel like you need to plan for your evidence and commentary. But I encourage my students to do that because number one, I think it helps them stay on track. And number two, I think it can help if you get like writer's block instead of like writing stream of consciousness, which just means like as the ideas come to you. I think it can be more helpful if you have a plan. So I would definitely do that. I would have a very simple outline. Now, someone else asked, what are your thoughts on not finishing your essay fully? Okay, that is actually super normal. So let's talk about like what you should prioritize if you know you're running out of time. First of all, do not write a long intro. In my opinion, your intro should be a couple sentences plus your thesis. Worst case scenario, like let's say you totally mismanage your time, just write a thesis. Just make sure you have something defensible. I would prioritize your body paragraphs. A lot of my students do too. And I used to have students that did 3 body paragraphs, but I feel like when they changed the AP Lang test a couple years ago, and the more I've taught my students how to like refine their writing, I feel like my students with the exception of a couple, most of them write 2 body paragraphs. But the key is they're trying really hard to develop those body paragraphs as well as they can. So you want to make sure that you are focusing on quality body paragraphs. And if you don't have time for a conclusion, do not worry about it. Is it possible to write a really strong conclusion that elevates your essay? Technically, yes. But a lot of the conclusions that we see students write are just kind of like one sentence where it's just like, it's basically like their thesis all over again. And sometimes those are actually like worse than just leaving it off. So don't worry about a conclusion. Like your essay is fine without one if you're running out of time. Also, I've seen essays where it kind of stops like mid paragraph. Like I've written that on students' papers before is like, this was really good. Clearly you didn't have time to finish. So I score what's in front of me. If you can have one really good quality developed body paragraph and then your second body paragraph is like halfway finished, then you can still score a 130. Like if you met the requirements in that first body paragraph and then you were starting to in the second, you've at least proven one claim. So it's possible it could get a 4 out of 6. So it's okay to have an unfinished essay. The other thing to realize is that these are viewed as a rough draft because clearly you are writing under duress. You've got 40 minutes on exam day. You've never seen the prompt before. So people take that into consideration when scoring your essays for the exam. So just kind of keep that in mind. But like, honestly, yes, like there are times when students' essays are unfinished and we grade what's there. So focus on like a quality, 1 or 2 quality body paragraphs, and don't stress about the conclusion. What do you need for a 4 or a 5? For a composite, So if you're doing the points thing that I was talking about earlier, then it is, sorry, it's backwards, but it's like 63 to 72 points is going to get you a 4 composite approximately. And then 73 to 100 would get you a 5. So remember, your multiple choice is 1 point each, and then you take your essay scores and you multiply it by approximately 3.0566. And that gets you a general number, and then you just round it. So yeah. Any tips on establishing a line of reasoning? My teacher didn't really explain it. Okay, so line of reasoning is kind of tricky, but here's how I think of it. It's a logical progression of ideas. So we want you to have a thesis that's going to be the core of your essay. That's your central argument. And then your body paragraphs are supposed to contain a claim, like a topic sentence with evidence and commentary that's supposed to prove your thesis. So it's kind of like a chain. I have my students do this activity in class where they literally make a paper chain, like you probably did when you were in like elementary school, but they're all color coded. And the reason is because I want them to realize that the ideas connect. One way to help your line of reasoning is to focus on having a strong thesis, because you can have a not so great thesis and still have it be defensible. So a good thesis, but also those topic sentences. You want someone to read your topic sentence and know what the paragraph is about without it saying like one device the writer uses is, or one choice the speaker makes is, or one reason. So we want to have it be a claim, but not so like one this is. We want it to prove the main idea, convey the main idea, but we want the wording to be a little bit more sophisticated. Something else you can do to help your line of reasoning with your topic sentences is for body paragraph 2, regardless of which essay type you're trying to write, connect your ideas. So like, for instance, in rhetorical analysis, it could be something like so-and-so then shifts from, and then whatever you talked about previously to, and then your new main idea. Or having already proven that, and then you talk about your previous main idea, the author then does this. And you can use that same one for synthesis, like having already proven that this, now this, that kind of thing. So use your topic sentences as a way to shift. For argument and synthesis, you could also try something like, the topic of like whatever you're talking about is not just important in, let's say, sports. Let's say that's your first main idea. It's also important in science. And so we know that we're shifting from a sports example to a science example. So use your topic sentences as a way to establish what the paragraph's about, but also to connect your ideas. Also use transition words effectively within your paragraph. So it can be really simple. Similarly, conversely, therefore, however, moreover, which is sort of like saying furthermore. Use transition words as well, because that's going to guide your reader and help your line of reasoning. So line of reasoning is basically just like your ideas progressing in a logical order. For rhetorical analysis, it helps if you analyze the passage chronologically. That's going to create a line of reasoning for you, or at least help you to, because you're following the speaker's line of reasoning. So I tell my students, divide your passage into either beginning, middle, and end, or first half, second half. And the reason why is because we have to realize that the speaker is making choices in a particular order in order to be effective. And so because of that, if you immediately start analyzing something at the end of the passage, that's not very effective. So you want to follow their order. So for rhetorical analysis, if you follow their line of reasoning, it'll help your line of reasoning. The other thing that I have my students think about with especially synthesis and argument is the order of their main ideas. So which main idea is going to be the strongest? Which one makes sense for it to come first? Because sometimes like there's a certain topic that you need to address before the other one. So sometimes that matters more than others, but also your evidence within your paragraph. Which quote is going to be best? Or, which paraphrase should I put first? You want to be asking yourself, what is the best order for things? So hopefully that helps with line of reasoning. But those are just some general tips. But yeah, if it was helpful, feel free to tap your screen a couple times, give it some likes so I know that it is helpful. Someone asked about like scratching out and like scribbling and stuff like that. Yeah, so on the exam, you have to write your essays in pen, blue or black ink, right? So you're probably going to mess up at some point. So you do not need to make it look like the CIA redacted your essay. You do not need to scribble out to the point where no one can ever read it. If you just do a strike through, like a line through it, the person's not going to read it. So that's actually better because sometimes when people are like scribbling stuff out on the exam, depending on what kind of pen you have, it's distracting, it's annoying. So yeah, you can just literally like cross through it and you're good. Now, let's say you want to add something. There's different ways to do it. If it's just like a little word, draw the little like caret or triangle, whatever you call it, and put the word in. They'll read that. But sometimes people draw arrows or they'll write in the margin, and that can be helpful. I've had students do like an asterisk and then like what they wanted to write they couldn't fit in that part of where they'd already written, so then they put an asterisk at the end of their paper and like you match it up. So like where that asterisk is, that little star, I know that the other part goes there. I would give your reader like directions if you can. Like it is helpful for me personally. If a student says like see asterisk on page 2, then I know, okay, like that's what the symbol's here for. I can go look for it, that kind of thing. I once had students like the sentences were not in the right order. So instead of drawing arrows, they literally labeled them. So it was like 2, 1. And that way I knew to not like read that or whatever it was. I knew to read them in the order that they were numbered. So like do what you can to make it easier for your reader, but they will not read it if it's scratched out. It does not count against you, but you just have to like put a line through it. You don't have to like crazy cross it out. That's the other thing too, is like I've seen a lot of students start over like halfway through their essay and they'll try to like black out the whole thing. Like if you're going to start over, like first of all, please like make sure that what you've written is not salvageable because you've already wasted a lot of time if you're starting over. But like don't also like try to cross it out entirely. Just an X through it or like a line through it is fine. But that's why if you plan first, you hopefully won't have to restart like that. Okay, let's answer a couple questions over on TikTok. I'm drafting a thesis on Hamlet's soliloquies. I understand the prompt and I have some facts for my synthesis, but I'm struggling to get ideas for what my thesis could be. That sounds like an interesting assignment, because I haven't really heard of anyone doing synthesis with Hamlet's soliloquies, before. I would say like tips for the thesis in general, though, you want to make sure that you have like an overarching argument that you can prove. Sometimes when your thesis is a bit more broad, like it still has to be specific enough that you've asserted a position and taken a side. But sometimes it helps if you leave it a little bit more open, and that way you can have main points that follow. But yeah, that's kind of a hard topic. I don't know that I've seen something with Hamlet and synthesis before. So I'm sorry I can't be more helpful as far as advising you. Someone said, like, what should I expect from the class? What are things that I need to know before signing up? Okay, so I think AP Lang can be very helpful for students because it teaches you how to argue and how to construct an argument. It also teaches you how to analyze nonfiction. And for most students, you're going to be going into a major where you are not going to be looking at poetry or things like that. So AP Lang is a very valuable class. It teaches you to analyze and to argue. Like I said, synthesis is kind of like a research paper, and that's very helpful because a lot of students write research papers in other disciplines in college. So as far as like what the class is going to be like, it's going to vary from teacher to teacher, but it's going to be a focus on nonfiction. I think it's going to teach you valuable life skills, and I'm not just saying that because I teach the class. I do think it's valuable. And as far as like what do you need to know before signing up, I would say you probably need to know that there's a decent amount of writing involved, but it helps make you a better writer. Talk to the students who are currently in the class at your school because sometimes they can give you better details. Because I can tell you what the class is like, but each teacher is a little bit different. Should I start with your strongest supporting claim? That's a good question. It kind of depends. If both claims are equal and like the order doesn't matter, then I would say probably yes. I had one of my students this week tell me that she started with her weaker claim and then her strongest one because she wanted to end on the strongest and end with like a high note. And honestly, that kind of worked in her favor because like her first example was okay, but the second example was like it was just in general better. So part of me says I like the idea of ending with your best example, but then part of me says I like the idea of leading with it because then you can make sure you have enough time to devote to it. Whereas if you put it last and you run out of time, that would be bad. So I think that would be something to consider as like your pacing. Regardless, as long as one paragraph is very fully developed, you technically can earn that 130. But again, it has to be proving everything that you need to. So yeah, it's hard to say. I read an essay recently where the student saved it for last, and I liked that. And I don't know, but I feel like regardless, if I were scoring it and they had flipped the paragraphs, I still would have been like, yes, this is the paragraph that elevates their essay to a 130. So something to think about. I would say if you know you have enough time to write both paragraphs, then maybe put it last. But if you're worried that you're not going to have time, then lead with your strongest idea. Just something to think about. How do you avoid repetitive commentary? Okay, so here's the thing. Like it gets a little difficult with commentary in general. One quick tip would be to make sure that you're using verbs like highlights, illustrates, demonstrates. Use the word because to keep pushing your commentary. But sometimes, yes, it feels like you don't really have anything new to say about the evidence. So I would try to, I guess it depends on like which essay we're talking about. But for synthesis and argument, keep asking yourself, like, why does this matter? Maybe if you haven't thought about the short-term impact, you could talk about that, or the long-term impact. Think about like who benefits. So I think it really just depends on like what your evidence is, but keep asking yourself why. I did an exercise in this with my 10th graders this week. They were doing a locavore synthesis, which is a prompt about eating locally. And I asked them, like, I forgot what the question was that I asked them, but something about someone said like their topic was going to be nutrition, like that locally grown food is more nutritious. And I said, okay, so why does that matter? And they all kind of looked at me and I was like, no, really, why does it matter? And they're like, well, because if you eat nutritious food, then you're going to be healthier. And I was like, okay, great. Why does that matter? And they like looked at me again. I'm like, no, seriously, why does it matter? And they're like, well, because if you're healthier, you're going to live longer. And I was like, why does that matter? And like, and then like when they finally realized why I was asking them that question, it was because I was trying to get them to broaden their commentary and keep going. Because if you just say like the first thing and you leave it at that, it wasn't really much commentary. But if you kept asking, why does that matter? Then you were getting into like these bigger issues and then your commentary is less repetitive. So keep asking yourself, why does this matter? For rhetorical analysis, instead of saying, why does this matter? Because that could work, but it might be more helpful for you to ask yourself, why this choice for this audience on this occasion. You really want to be thinking about why the speaker is making that particular choice for that audience on that occasion. Especially if it's like a speech or a letter, they're targeting a specific audience. They're speaking for some reason, whether it's a eulogy or an inauguration or a conference. So they're tailoring it to their audience. So those are things to consider as well. Can your introduction just be a thesis? Yes. I do recommend trying to write like a sentence or two before it if possible, but like worst case scenario, just write your thesis. Because that's really the only point you get in your intro anyway. So yeah, good question. Let's see. Yeah, Hamlet is weird. Hamlet is usually done in like more of like AP Lit. I like Hamlet. I actually prefer Macbeth. Like if I had to teach one or the other, I think I would probably teach Macbeth. But I just haven't had my students write about Hamlet and stuff. So I don't know. The college board videos. Yeah, they're the videos. So they do have on AP Classroom, they do have videos like for each unit. And I think the videos can be helpful to an extent. But I get that sometimes watching like videos in general, if it's not based on the prompt you're answering, it can be a little tricky. Do you have any multiple choice tips? So yes, it depends on like which one you're wanting, either just general or like reading or writing. General tips, first of all, answer every question on test day, even if it's just a guess, because you have 5 answer choices. So technically you have a 20% chance of getting it right, even if you're totally guessing. And that way you want to make sure you're setting yourself up to try to get those points. A lot of my students tend to prefer the writing questions, which are the last 3 passages. So keep in mind that the passages are shorter, there's fewer questions, so you might not take as long with that. You might need a little bit more time with the reading. You can practice these by using SAT tests and ACT tests. There's certain questions on the SAT and the ACT that are not on AP Lang, but in general, if you're already studying for the SAT or the ACT, then you are studying for AP Lang. For the reading specifically, I would say some students benefit from looking at the questions first. Some people don't. But I do an exercise with my students where I have them like read the questions first, not the answers, just the questions, and kind of bracket off. So if it says like, what is the function of the first paragraph? I have them on like their paper, bracket it off and put like the number of the question. And some students say it really helps to know the questions in advance because they know what to look for. So they can like read with a purpose. I've had other students be like, nope, it throws me off. I just want to read the passage and then look at it. I would say for questions where it's asking you about a specific paragraph, always go back and reread that paragraph. Don't just do it from memory. If it's asking you about a specific line number, like what is the writer doing in these lines, go back and definitely read those lines. Maybe read the surrounding lines as well. If it's like a word, like what does this word in line, whatever mean, don't just go to that one line, read the surrounding lines, because oftentimes there's a context clue. If you read like the whole paragraph or at least like the sentence before it and the next sentence that has the word in it, usually you are a little bit more accurate because there's usually a context clue. Something else is to know that sometimes one single word can make the answer choice wrong. So cross out any answer choices that you know are wrong. Use process of elimination, but sometimes literally one word can make the answer choice wrong. So if you know something's wrong, don't try to rationalize it. Like, don't try to be like, oh, well, maybe I misread the passage. Like, no, if it's wrong, it's wrong. Let's see. For question 3, what should I do if I spend too much time planning? So here's the thing, like, I didn't like this is just personal experience, but I did a mock exam last year with my students, and I spent like I always tell them like approximately how much time they should plan and how much time they should write, and I spent more time planning than writing. This is gonna sound so dumb, but I just wrote faster. And don't worry about the neatness of your handwriting. Don't worry about crossing something out. Like, like obviously it's okay to do so, but don't like stop being a perfectionist. I don't know if that applies to you, but for me, I try to have like neat penmanship and stuff. As long as we can read it and we see some really interesting handwriting, just write. Don't worry about your spelling. Don't worry about your grammar. Like those things go out the window. Get the words on the page. Prioritize your stronger ideas. Prioritize your evidence and commentary, especially your commentary. I would much rather a student write a short intro, like just a thesis, and like one solid body paragraph, and maybe like worst case scenario, half of the other one, and just stop the essay. Like you clearly ran out of time. I would rather you do that than try to shorten your body paragraphs. Like don't shrink your essay, if that makes sense. If you are running out of time, don't compromise your development, because you can still score well if you have one really good paragraph. If you have 2 really good paragraphs and no conclusion, that's okay. So if you mismanage your time, focus on developing your ideas. Don't try to like smush everything, if that makes sense. Like don't try to write a shorter essay so that you can have 4 paragraphs. Like no, that doesn't matter. Write like I would much rather you write like a short intro and like 1 to 2 body paragraphs that are longer than trying to compress everything to make it like finished. Do we have to use a split thesis? Could you clarify what you mean by that? Because I'm not totally sure. I've heard of a closed thesis and an open thesis. A lot of people write a closed thesis. A lot of teachers prefer an open thesis. Both are fine. But I'm not sure what you mean by a split thesis. So if you could either clarify or give me an example, I could hopefully answer your question a little bit more accurately. For rhetorical analysis, is it okay to say through various rhetorical choices? Please don't, because that's kind of assumed. So please just tell us the choices that you're going to analyze. So a lot of times I'll see students write like, I don't know, like Florence Kelly uses a lot of rhetorical choices, including this. You don't need to tell me that she used rhetorical choices. Like, I know you're writing about that. Just tell me the choices that you're going to analyze. And if you can, use stronger rhetorically accurate verbs instead of saying uses repetition, say repeats this or something like that. But yeah, you do not need to tell us that that they use rhetorical strategies, devices, choices. Just because those words are in the prompt does not mean they need to be in your thesis. Just tell us what you're going to be actually talking about in your essay. Good question, though. Thank you for clarifying. How do I avoid rereading sections? That's a good question. I did that all the time as a student. Um, so, okay, here's the thing though. When you have sometimes for the writing, you kind of strategically have to reread. So, let me give you an example. When the question says like the writer wants to add the following sentence, um, I read the sentence that they want to add, and then I go back to the passage and I read the paragraph where they're wanting to add it because it doesn't take that long. Usually the paragraphs are a few sentences. So I read the excuse me, I read the paragraph and I ask myself, like, first of all, like, should they add this sentence? Yes or no? In order to know that, we have to figure out like what's the main idea. So like if the sentence they want to add is not relevant, like it's on a tangent, then I would be like, no, they shouldn't add it because it's not relevant. Then I'm going to go to my answer choices and I'm going to go straight to the 2 answer choices or 3 that say no. And I'm going to look for the one that is most similar to what I just said. And that streamlines the process. So yes, you kind of still have to go back and reread the paragraph because if you're going to add a sentence, you need to know, does it fit the main idea? But it shouldn't be a very taxing process. And sometimes you should add the sentence. So like if the sentence is adding a definition or clarity or something that is helpful, then yes. So sometimes you do have to go back and reread it. The ones that are kind of annoying are the ones where it's like, what order should the sentences be in? And then it's like 3, 2, 1, 1, 3, 2, and like those. So for those, if you look for words like this, that, these, those, it's usually this. Words that are kind of like a vague pronoun, you can't say the word this without having already told us what the this is. And so usually if things are out of order, you can figure out that there's like a word that was vague, or sometimes when you read the paragraph, it's not in chronological order. Like there's one on an old ACT where like it talks about how they had their flashlights scanning the cave. And then like a couple sentences later, it's like, we turned on our flashlights. Yeah, those are not in the right order. The we turned on our flashlights has to come before you're using your flashlight to scan the cave. So sometimes as you're reading it, you can kind of realize like, oh, these aren't in the right order, and that can kind of streamline it. But unfortunately, sometimes you do have to reread a little bit in order to do that. Let's see, what else we got? My school is taking it online. Do you have any knowledge about how the online goes? I have looked up a little bit, and I think like, because we did online a couple years ago, I think things are going to be a little bit better. Like they've streamlined the process. I will look into like more concrete information, like, but the College Board did post something on their website. But it used to be that you couldn't like skip around on multiple choice. I think they're allowing that now. I think you have more freedom to navigate on the digital test, which is going to be good. And then hopefully you're able to practice a little bit too. Like hopefully your teachers may be giving you something on like AP Classroom, and that kind of thing. But I don't think the experience is going to be that different. There should be like a timer on your screen and things, or at least there used to be things like that. So the way your test looks is going to be very similar. It's just that you won't have the physical paper. I think the thing that's going to be important is, and I will look into this too, is we need to figure out how to annotate effectively. Because if you're able to use like your computer, but if you get scratch paper or something, that could help your process. If you're having to highlight on the computer, that's going to change it. So the biggest question I would have as a student is, how can I annotate? Because I think that's going to be the thing that would be the biggest hurdle to overcome. So I'll look into that more. So that way, hopefully I can give more concrete info. And I will be going live each Sunday at 3 p.m. Eastern time. I've been on for about an hour. I had to stop the live in the middle because something random happened on TikTok. But I'm trying to go live for at least an hour each week. So if you're not following on TikTok or YouTube, please do so. Please follow on both platforms if you're able to. That way you can ask your questions each week. And then as it gets closer to the exam, I'm going to be doing more workshops for students and more lives that are a bit more specific. Right now, I'm just trying to do Q&A, but I will be doing ones that are tailored to a specific topic later on, not just like Q&A to help even more. So if you're not following, please do so, especially on TikTok. I'm very close to 10K. And one of the benefits of getting to 10K is that when I get that milestone, then I can make playlists. So right now, if students want to find something on my page, they literally have to like go through each like thumbnail or whatever you want to call it. But if I can make a playlist and you're like, I want to know rhetorical analysis tips, then I can just have a playlist for you to go to. And it would probably be a lot easier because I have playlists on YouTube. So if you're not following, please do so. It would really help. I'm currently writing a 4-page synthesis. Any tips? That's a long, long synthesis. I'm assuming it's double spaced though. I would say the biggest thing is make sure you're using the correct number of sources. With synthesis, I like to see students using like 2 sources within a paragraph because it creates that conversation of sources. Also really focus on your organization. Like, are your body paragraphs in the most logical order? Are you using transitions? For synthesis too, it really helps to learn how to embed your quotes. I don't know if you have talked about this in your class or not, but I tell my students, I don't like to see according to source A. Now you could say like, according to a 2017 survey from the Pew Research Center. That's going to sound better than according to source A. So you can use the source's original credentials, and you should have a citation. For synthesis, we typically put it in parentheses at the end of the sentence. So one of the things that kind of helps if you haven't written a synthesis paper before is to know how to cite properly to make your essay read a little bit more smoothly. That would be something that I would say to focus on if you haven't already done that. Because citations and like embedding short quotes is helpful. That also helps in rhetorical analysis. Try not to get in the habit of choosing these really long quotes and just sticking them in your essay because it doesn't read well. So we want shorter quotes that you can put into a sentence of your own. Let's see. Is there a minimum amount of commentary I should write? So that's a good question. I tell my students you should have more commentary than evidence. Now, technically, you can have evidence and commentary in the same sentence, but I tell them like at least a 1-to-2 ratio, meaning like if you have 1 sentence with evidence in it, I want to see at least 2 sentences of commentary. Some of my better students do 1-to-3. I know of teachers who require 1-to-4. That's kind of hard. I'm not going to lie. So I would say 1-to-2, ideally 1-to-3 is appropriate. If you can do more than that, great. But that's where it starts to get like a little bit repetitive sometimes. But we definitely want to see more commentary than evidence for sure. But there's not like a concrete rule about that. If that's what you're asking, like there's not like a rule about like on the rubric, you must have this much commentary. What I meant by a split thesis is, do we have to put each body paragraph point in the thesis? Okay, so that's a good question. No, it can be more open-ended. A lot of students do like to do a closed thesis, meaning like they would say their main ideas. And so whatever the first thing they say is, that goes to body paragraph 1, the second thing, body paragraph 2. Those are easier to come up with under pressure, if I'm being honest. Like that's just my opinion. So some teachers do not like a closed thesis. They don't like you to like name drop devices for rhetorical analysis, things like that. To me, I view it as a rough draft, a timed essay. Just write your thesis. But so there's nothing wrong with mentioning your main points. There are times when I think you shouldn't. So for instance, argument essays, like usually if it's a more open thesis, that tends to read better. So like for instance, the prompt I gave my AP kids, let's see, last week was about exploring the unknown. So let's say that they want to talk about how exploring the unknown is valuable because it leads to innovation and personal growth. Now, that's still kind of a closed thesis because you would assume that my first paragraph is going to be about innovation and my second paragraph is going to be about personal growth. So it's kind of like a compromise because you know the direction the paper is going. But just because I said innovation, you know that's the main idea, but you don't know what evidence I'm going to bring up. When students put their exact evidence in their thesis, that's when it reads kind of so-so. Like, so don't tell me your exact examples. Give me like a broader category. That usually helps for synthesis and arguments. So it's okay to put your main ideas there, but don't say like the exact example, because then it feels really redundant. So hopefully that helps. All right. Any other questions? Thank you for the likes on TikTok, by the way. I have a rhetorical essay analysis essay due tomorrow. Do you have any tips? So yes, usually one of the things that people forget about rhetorical analysis is make sure that you are connecting to message, argument, or purpose, whichever one your prompt is asking for. And really consider the rhetorical situation. So ask yourself, why is the speaker or the writer making this choice for this audience on this occasion? Because they're going to be making certain choices based on who their audience is and like what's going on in the world at the time, or like why they're speaking. So those are the biggest things. I do have several videos on YouTube about rhetorical analysis because that's kind of like my favorite one to teach. So if you have questions about like rhetorical analysis, I have a lot of videos. Do you know what your prompt is? Like if you have an essay due tomorrow, what's the prompt? I'm just curious if it's what I'm familiar with. I never thought about it, but why is it important to recognize the claims that counter your own? Oh, okay, that's a good question. So you technically don't have to do this. It's just a technique that people do. And the reason why is because if you can like acknowledge the opposing side and then refute it, then by proving the other side wrong, it's kind of implied that you're right. So it's a technique that people use to further their own argument. It's not required. It can lead to a stronger argument. Sometimes it falls kind of flat. So a lot of times students are told like, put a counterclaim and rebuttal in your essay. But like sometimes it doesn't actually strengthen the essay. So you should really do it if it's going to strengthen your essay. But basically by proving the other side wrong, and then proving why your side is right, you're furthering your argument. That's all. And you can do it in a couple different ways. There's something called a concession and refutation. That's the one that I prefer. There's a time and a place for a counterclaim and a rebuttal. A concession and refutation is a bit nicer because you're acknowledging the merit of the other side. So you could say something like, while it's true that, and then whatever the other side says, one must also consider this, and here's why. Or certainly it's true that this happens, but we need to focus on this. And so that way you're not totally bashing the other side. And one of the benefits of that too is it shows that you have considered the other side. And like, if you think about it, if you know that somebody's considered both sides of something and then they come to this conclusion, then there's a little bit of credibility that you've built up there. Because if the person hasn't considered the other side, then it might feel like they've ignored something or it's one-sided. So that could be a reason why people include it as well. How do you create an open thesis? They're hard. I'm going to be really honest. They are difficult, but for rhetorical analysis, really focus on like what the writer is doing, less so devices, but more of like what they're doing overall. I honestly, like, my students tend to write closed thesis statements. When I score for our state exam, and I've been an AP reader for a couple years, I mean, it was super rare to see an open thesis. So it's not that I don't want people to not know what they are or not know how to write them. It's just that sometimes an open thesis can seem, for rhetorical analysis at least, it can seem like a summary, or it's just like, I don't know, like I feel like there's a degree of closed thesis statements. Like a closed thesis statement sometimes gets a bad reputation, but it's not necessarily bad. Like, I don't like my students to say like the author uses diction and syntax. Like, that's not a great thesis. But if they say something like, you know, through the author's word choice and sentence structure, they are able to do X, Y, Z, then that's a little bit more open. So it's really about how you structure your sentence. I would focus on, for rhetorical analysis, using strong, rhetorically accurate verbs. For argument and synthesis, I would focus on kind of like the big picture idea, not the specific example, if that makes sense. But yeah, most people write a closed thesis. But there's a range of what a closed thesis is. Like there's some that are very weak, if I'm in my opinion, and then there's some that are like a bit more open-ended and they're not bad. Oh, okay. Let's see. Oh, Malala, the speech on okay, so construct an argument concerning whether or not the author is successful. Okay, so ooh, okay. Interesting. That one is not exactly how it would be phrased on the exam, if I'm being honest. So good speech though. I'm pretty familiar with the speech. But so first of all, make sure that you are looking at what her message is. So if your prompt says like how successful she is in presenting it, again, that's not how the College Board would phrase it, but that's okay. Make sure you're very clear on what her message is. And then think about if she's speaking, I think you said at the UN. So think about who her audience is and like why she's the best person to give this speech. Because if she's speaking on education, and we know that Malala was shot on her way to school, like to get an education, like she is like a very strong person to speak and about this issue because of her backstory. So things like that. So really think about what is her message, who is her audience, why is she the right person to be giving the speech, things like that. Let's see. A couple questions. Can you give tips on arguments? Okay. So oh, do closed thesis tend to score better? Not necessarily. Here's the thing about the thesis point. If you have a thesis, you get the point. Like, yes, some thesis statements are pretty weak, but they're defensible, and some are amazing. You could have the best thesis I've ever seen, and you would get 1 point. You could have the worst thesis I've ever seen. As long as it's still defensible, you still get that same 1 point. So just that some teachers really hate that, and I kind of understand why. But like, here's the thing: if it's defensible, you get the point. So don't stress about the thesis, because a couple years ago, for I think rhetorical analysis, it was approximately 92% of people got the thesis point. For argument and synthesis, it was like between 95 and 97. One year, I think it was as much as 98. Keep in mind that some people leave the essay blank and therefore don't have a thesis point. And then some people, it's rare, but some people just write something and they don't get the thesis point. But if we have over 90% of people getting it, you just got to write something defensible. Now, as far as the argument tips, the big thing about an argument essay is you want to have specific evidence. So really concrete evidence that you can write about well. Don't generalize. I encourage students not to do hypothetical examples. Try to prioritize real world examples, current events, history. You can write about personal experience, that's fine, but be specific, and then make sure you analyze like what does this example show about the topic at hand. But specific evidence is going to be the key. My best rhetorical analysis tips, make sure you're connecting to whatever the prompt is asking. So like, is it the message, argument, or purpose? Identify what the message is or what the purpose is. And then really consider how the rhetorical situation impacts that. I do have a couple of videos on my channel. I think there's one that literally I called like my best tip for rhetorical analysis. So if you type in like Coach Hall Wright's best tip for rhetorical analysis, that video gives like a much more detailed explanation of what I'm trying to say. But basically, you want to be thinking about why they're making that choice and analyzing it. So it's not just about like identifying what they're doing and providing evidence. The commentary is what elevates your score. I want to write a closed thesis, but I can't come up with that ideas on the spot. What should I do? Okay, so like an open thesis is fine too. I think the biggest thing is just okay, so it depends on which essay we're talking about, but just kind of brainstorm like what are your main ideas. And I think that would be most helpful. I do have some sentence frames that can be somewhat helpful as well. So I have some for argument and synthesis, and I also have some for rhetorical analysis. And I think on my YouTube channel, Coach Hall Writes on YouTube, I think I have a playlist about thesis statements. Pretty sure. If not, if you type in like Coach Hall Writes thesis statements, I have blog posts for a couple things and videos where I give examples and templates. So that might help you like be able to do it more quickly. I'm taking AP Lang next year. Do you think I'll be able to do good in that class? I think you can. I would encourage you to talk to your current teacher, talk to people who are in the class, and just give it your best. But here's the thing about AP, like as much as yes, the exam is important and it can mean, you know, like college credit for some people, you learn a lot just by being in the class. Like obviously each school is different, but I have had some students in the past not make the 3 composite. They went on to be very successful in college. So your score does not define you. And they were like, you know what? I'm glad I took the class because it just wasn't my day that day. But I learned a lot and I'm a better writer. And like that's the thing that I love about AP Lang is it teaches you how to analyze and articulate your ideas. So I would encourage you to take it. Is grammar important on the essay portion? No. They do say to have like appropriate grammar, but you can have spelling mistakes, you can have subject verb issues, you can have like comma splices. It doesn't matter. It's nice when people don't because then it's easier to read, but like no, like there's as long as we can read it. And I've had students who had pretty severe dyslexia and like spelled things like phonetically, but therefore incorrectly. They still made very high composite scores. As long as we can read it, we're good. So I tell my students not to stress about grammar. Because quite frankly, even as a teacher, I still make typos and mistakes and stuff. So like, don't stress. It is a rough draft. You have 40 minutes. Like if you spell a word wrong, it's not the end of the world. But they do put it on the like the thing. They do put like make sure you have appropriate grammar. I kind of wish they would take that off though, because I feel like that's a little bit misleading. Grammar doesn't affect your score. What's the hardest for AP Lang? That kind of depends. Like usually rhetorical analysis has the lowest average score. Like not always, like sometimes it's not the lowest, but if you look holistically, usually rhetorical analysis tends to have the lowest score. I like rhetorical analysis and I probably because of that, I think that impacts the teaching that I do. So my students say the argument is the hardest because they don't like having to come up with their own evidence and I don't blame them. So like I would say rhetorical analysis is the hardest to learn. I start with that and then we go back to it after we've done like synthesis and argument. Like, and I actually have my students in 10th and 11th grade, sometimes 12th grade, depending on which class they take. I start teaching rhetorical analysis in 10th grade to get them ready. So in that regard, I would say rhetorical analysis is the hardest because it takes the longest to get comfortable with it, in my opinion. When incorporating current events, do you need to know the exact names of people? It does help, but like they're not going to fact check you. But and like sometimes people have used like the wrong name and stuff, but it does help. Like because if you just say like some guy on TikTok, like that's not very specific. But like if you don't know the exact date of something, but you can kind of ballpark it, it's okay. So I don't want to like mislead you here because yes, you do want to be as specific as possible and like names are important. So it kind of depends on what you're talking about and how you write it. Do you have any structure templates for advice for students that are struggling with writing? So that's a good question. I would say I have like sentence frames. Like that's how I help my students. And I have so I have some sentence frame videos for teachers that probably would not help students, but I have some videos, a lot of my videos actually have sentence frames in them. So that's how I help my students with their writing is like a sentence frame, if you're not familiar with it, is like it's a sentence starter. Like it gets you going, but you have to plug in your own ideas. So it's not like cheating or anything. It's just a way for you to articulate your ideas. And I do have like a bunch of them put together for teachers as well. I'm assuming I don't know if the person asking is a teacher or a student, but like I do have them like put together in kind of like a little booklet thing or like a resource, but they're in a lot of my videos. So if you watch some of my rhetorical analysis videos and you see like kind of like sentence starters on the screen, those are the sentence frames. And that's helped my students the most because that way they have like something to fall back on if they're super stressed out. Yes. Oh, your rhetorical analysis essays made me a much better writer. Thank you. I remember you reached out and I was so happy to hear how those videos had helped you. Parent of an AP Lang student. Okay, got it. So yes, I hold on. Like I wish I knew exactly which videos to direct you to. 'Cause I know that they're in a lot of my videos, but I have like in some of my videos, I've linked them in the description box too. But I do have videos where I have the sentence frames in the videos, if that helps. Do the essays that seem heavily structured score well? I've read a few that are kind of like arguably formulaic and they're College Board samples and they still score well. Cause the one that I'm thinking of, well, we did it like like last week or a week ago, exploring the unknown. There was one essay, there's two in the release samples that got a 6, and one is very atypical, very creative. And then the other one also got a 6, and it's very like not formulaic in a bad way, but formulaic nonetheless. And I had my students look at both of them, and I kind of told them, because they were writing the prompt, I said, like, choose one method. Like, if you want to be creative, go for it. Try it out on this prompt. And then if not, here's what I like about this one. It had really good transitions and really good topic sentences, and it was just very like structured. And so half my students did one and half my students did the other. But those are a good model. If you want a good structured model for argument, the exploring the unknown prompt, the ones that were rescored with the new rubric, so they're typed essays. There's one that scored a 141, and it's about like there's a paragraph about music. It ends with a paragraph about Thoreau, but that's a good essay. If you're looking for like a good structured example, that's a really good model because it scored well. Are they on TPT? Yes, they are. Let me see if I can find you that link real quick and put it on YouTube. Although if you're asking me that question, it's possible that you may have found them. All right. So any other questions over on TikTok? Feel free to ask anything about the exam. And if you think of a question later on, then I will be on next week as well. Okay, I think this would be the one that you need. Sorry, I'm trying to multitask. Okay, so to the parent that's asking about it, I have this may or may not help. It's got some sentence frames for both rhetorical and synthesis. But feel free to reach out to me later on if you have additional questions. I'd be happy to kind of direct you where you need to go. What about the online exam? I'm going to do more research on that because they changed how they did it. They've made positive changes because I know a lot of people were skeptical about the online test. But the biggest question I have is like, I want to know how to advise students because my students are taking it on paper, but the students, like the annotations is going to be the thing that I'm most worried about. So I'm going to do some research and I'll be able to report back to y'all next week. I'll also, depending on what I find, I might make a video on it as well. Like to help students because my own students are not taking the digital test. I admittedly haven't done as much research, so I don't want to mislead anybody. So I will look into it and I'll report back to y'all. But that would be my biggest question about the digital test is like, what is going to be the best way for you to annotate and organize your ideas? But I don't think it's going to be bad. Like, I do think, like, on one hand, you'll be able to type better. Like, some people type better than they handwrite, like, more quickly. And you should be able to navigate between, like, you have to be within a section. But it used to be a couple years ago, you couldn't go backwards. So if you answered a question, you couldn't go back to it. I think they've changed that because that was, like, one of the biggest, like, fears that people had. How do I improve my multiple choice scores? Good question. Usually writing is a little bit easier to improve more quickly than the reading. So I'm not really sure what your breakdown is. You might already be strong in the writing ones, but the reading scores are a little bit harder because they kind of depend on the passage. But I have some videos about just general tips. If you are studying for the SAT or ACT, then that could be a great way to help, especially because I think the ACT has this too, but I see it more with the SAT, like they have answer explanations. Now, sometimes the released answer explanations are not super helpful, but it's good to kind of like, let's say you're studying for the SAT as well as AP Lang. If you get an answer wrong, then instead of just being like, oops, it was D, like actually go back and be like, okay, wait a minute, I chose A, but the answer is D. How can I work backwards to justify it? So like learn from your mistakes, if that makes sense. Also get a study buddy. And the reason I say that is because right now my students are preparing for the ACT And so we've been doing a lot of multiple choice like throughout the past couple weeks. And one method that I have is I time them because I want them to get used to a little bit of pressure, and I'll time them for one passage. And then like last week, what I had them do is I said, hey, for your table group, choose a question that most of you, if not all of you, got right and talk it out. Even though you got it right, just talk it out. And then choose one that y'all pretty much got wrong and talk it out. And my students said that like getting to hear other people's explanations of like why it's right and like how to think it through was helpful. And sometimes as a teacher, it's easier, not easier, but sometimes students can explain it better to each other than a teacher can. So get a study partner. I would say for multiple choice in general, really work on eliminating answers that you know are wrong, process of elimination, get familiar with the types of questions asked. But there's a lot of like little tips I could give for different types of questions. I do have some videos on it, so check out those too. But if you know that you're stronger at the writing questions, then I have students who on the paper test, like they will flip to the writing questions because they know that that's their strength. Because basically the multiple choice questions, each one is worth 1 point on the exam. 45 questions, 45% of your composite. So we want to be strategic. We want to get as many points right as possible. So don't linger on a question that you could potentially get wrong. Like don't spend like 3 minutes trying to, is it A or is it B? Like just pick one. And if you have time, go back to it, but you don't want to be rushing at the end of your test if you can avoid that. Each question, no matter how hard it is worth 1 point. Are progress checks on College Board accurate? Yes and no. If you're taking them seriously, please know that your score might fluctuate. Last year, my students, I believe, took them very seriously. And my students who were constantly in like and we didn't do all 9. I think we did like 6 of the 9, but that's okay. So my students who were in the dark green and getting like 80% right, those students earned a 5, hands down. But I kind of assumed that they were going to. My students who were sometimes in the dark green, sometimes in the light green, those are my students who tended to get a 4 last year. My students who were sometimes in the light green, but occasionally in the yellow, those were my students who got a 3 because they were mostly in the light green. I hope you all get the color-coded thing that we do. Otherwise, that'll make 0 sense to you. My students who primarily lived in the yellow last year, those were the students that got a 2. Like they might have occasionally gone up to a green, but they were more often than not, they were in like the 33% right range or more. So those are the students that tended to get a 2. So yes, I do think they can be accurate, but also I say this because I had a student who is one of my top students and has had phenomenal multiple choice scores just do a progress check last week and was like, that was not a good score. And I'm like, you know what? It means nothing. Like it is fine. It is, because like sometimes you have a bad day. Sometimes the test is hard. So like if you are used to getting like greens and you get a yellow, do not freak out. If you are getting a bunch of yellows and you're like, I'm never going to get a green, that's not true. Like, so yes, they can be helpful, but I don't want you to overthink it either. I don't want you to think you're like doomed or something. But as a teacher, like, do I analyze like the results carefully to see like where people are? Yes. Yes, I do. I try to at least. All right. Oh, your video helped. Thank you. I'm so glad the video was helpful. All right, so I've been on for like an hour and a half between the 2 different lives that I did. So I'm gonna hop off, I think, but I will be back next week at 2 p.m. my time, which is Central Time, so 3 p.m. Eastern. I'm gonna go live each week on YouTube and also on TikTok to answer questions, and I'll be doing some like trainings for students as well, like more specific stuff, not just Q&A. So I hope to be able to announce those either next week or the week after. So be sure to come back each week and ask your questions. And thank you for the likes on TikTok, by the way. Please make sure that you're following on both platforms. I know I've already said this. If you've been here for a hot minute, you've heard me say that if you follow on TikTok, that would really help me out because I'm trying to get to 10K on TikTok so I can make playlists. And the playlists are going to make it easier for students to find my videos on TikTok. So if you're an AP Lang student and you don't mind, just give me a quick follow. You can sadly unfollow after the exam, but it would really help me out to help you if I can make playlists. Thank you so much. I hope you all have a great week, and I hope to see you next week in our Q&A. Bye.